Welcome to the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. We interview remarkable and thought-provoking guests about innovation, leadership, and change in the world of business. Whether you're an executive or an entrepreneur, our objective is to help you and your organisation create an entrepreneurial culture, become more innovative, and better able to respond to change. Each week, we'll deconstruct world-class performance from the arenas of business, academia, science, and sports. Each week, you can expect key insights, fresh perspectives, and proven tools you can use straight away to make you more successful professionally and personally. With your host, Mark Bidwell.
Welcome to the opening episode of Season 2 of the Innovation Ecosystem Podcast. My name is Mark Bidwell. I'd like to welcome back previous listeners, those of you who've tuned in for previous episodes. Welcome back, great to have you, and we've got a really exciting season ahead of us. And for those of you who are new to the show, welcome. It's good to have you on board, and I really hope that you find something of interest in this show, as well as I would suggest listening to some of the previous episodes, particularly the recap, our earlier episode, which went through some of the background of what I'm trying to achieve on this show. So, by way of introduction to the second season, some of you might know that I've lived for well over 10 years in Switzerland, a country with a little over 8 million people. I live in the third largest city in the country, a place called Basel, which is on the border of France and Germany to the northwest of the country. Basel's got a population of less than 200,000 people, so it's about the same size as Ipswich in the UK or Fort Lauderdale in the US. It's not enormous, to be honest with you. And yet, from where I'm sitting, I'm looking at the headquarters of three global leaders in the fields of agribusiness, which is Syngenta, and pharmaceuticals, which is Novartis and Roche, both of which are leading players in their industry. And these three companies have a combined market capitalization of almost $500 billion. And that's just Basel. There are many Swiss companies that lead their markets. Companies like Nestle, which is 150 years old this year, and which recently developed the Nespresso machine made famous by George Clooney. Banks, machinery, manufacturers, textiles, tourism. In a tiny landlocked country with so few natural advantages, why is it that Switzerland has become so successful for so long at so many things? This has intrigued me for many years since I've been living here. So to answer this, I invited James Breiding, who's author of the book Swiss Made, The Untold Story Behind Switzerland's Success, onto the Innovation Ecosystem show. James has had a fascinating career, working with the Rothschilds, with Sir John Templeton, and his contributions to the book have been supported by a fellowship from Harvard University. And when he was writing this book, he interviewed over 300 people, had access to multiple case studies, as well as the leaders of many of the fascinating businesses that he's been studying. And what he produced is, in his own words, a chronicle of Swiss innovation. Essentially what he's doing is he's telling the untold story behind Switzerland's success, and it's packed full of wisdom and anecdotes that I think business leaders, intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs who are interested in making themselves and their organizations more innovative and more entrepreneurial will learn enormous amounts from. So I hope you enjoy the first show in the second season of the Innovation Ecosystem. With me today is James Breiding, who's the author of Swiss Made, The Untold Story Behind Switzerland's Success, which is a bestseller that's translated into 8 languages. So welcome to the show, James.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So what led up to you writing the book Swiss Made?
I had a brief spell sort of writing for The Economist at one stage, and when I was doing research about and trying to understand how Switzerland worked, I came across a book called, in German, Das Heimliche Imperium, that was written by Lorenz Stucki, that I thought was a wonderful book, but it was published in 1960, so it was quite a long time ago. And I just happened to be at a cocktail party, and the former, at the time, he was the editor of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is Switzerland's leading paper. We just happened to stumble upon this book, and I said would be a great idea to write something like this and make it available in English. And it turned out that he grew up in the same village as this fellow, Lorenz Stucki, and Lorenz Stucki's father was a very famous diplomat during World War II, and his father knew his father, and one thing led to another, and he introduced me to the book publishing arm of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and here I was, a young writer who didn't have a manuscript, but had a publisher for something that was in my head. So that's how it came about.
And you mentioned diplomats. I mean, I think when we first spoke, James, you say this book, your book, gets given to any Swiss diplomat to present to their host nation when they arrive on a diplomatic mission. Is that correct?
Well, it wasn't intended to be written for diplomats. It just so happened that I think Switzerland went through a very difficult period, particularly because of the banks, where there was a lot of Swiss bashing for a long period of time. And I think part of the reason I wrote the book was because I thought there was a lot more to Switzerland than sort of met the eye, if you like. I mean, a lot of people come to Switzerland for a weekend or Davos, and they walk away with a fairly superficial impression. And quite a lot of people think Switzerland's about cuckoo clocks or chocolate or dubious banks. And so I thought there was just a lot more to it. And the purpose was just to get the story right. And I think, after I wrote it, it got some critical acclaim from opinion leaders outside of Switzerland. So Larry Summers endorsed the book, and Lee Kuan Yew arranged to have a copy given to all members of GIC and Temasek. Paul Volcker said something about the book. So that was sort of, I think, if you like, a tonic on the wound for a lot of these ambassadors who had been having a tough go at selling Switzerland. So meanwhile, it's given by 50 Swiss embassies around the world as a diplomatic gift. And in fact, 2 embassies, the Swiss embassy in Vietnam and the Swiss embassy in Poland, we've donated the rights, the manuscript to them, and they've undertaken on their own nickel to produce the book and made like 5,000 copies in each case that they use and distribute for the purpose of raising awareness of Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you mentioned Swiss banking, but you and I are both living in Switzerland, but a lot of our listeners would be familiar with the Nespresso machine, for instance, the Swatch. So how would you describe the Swiss brand of doing business, and what are some of the success factors that contribute to, Switzerland's economic strength?
Right. Well, I think, you mentioned very notable innovations, and I think that's part of maybe the issue that, particularly now there's this whole notion of disruptive innovation. And if you're in a B2C business, innovations can be very visual and very sexy, things like Teslas and Facebooks and these sorts of things. But a lot of Swiss industry is B2B businesses, which is really fundamentally quite boring. And if you're in a B2B business where you're producing a textile machinery for, an Asian producer of textiles, you just have to be slightly better than the competition, slightly more convenient, slightly cheaper to win the business. And so I think a lot of the innovation in Switzerland is really below the radar stuff, which is, not particularly exciting and sexy, but gets the job done. So I think,
so more incremental versus breakthrough innovation, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the very notable things. Espresso was a very large breakthrough, and it broke down a lot of habits of housewives and people in their household of how they went about drinking coffee. And Swatch, of course, was also a major breakthrough. But by and large, the things that we don't hear about and read about are things like elevators at Schindler or turbines at ABB, or plastic produced by Ems Chemie, which is more resistant to heat or to noise on autobahns in Germany. So these are just things that, and very often they're working closely with the companies as sort of a supplier-customer relationships where they're tweaking things together. So it's probably more development than research, I'd say. Yeah. But otherwise, in terms of, those factors that make Switzerland successful or have made it successful and continue to make successful, part of it's, I think, sort of inherent to small countries. As a small country, you have a very small domestic market, so you're forced to export your product very quickly. So, with 5 or 8 employees, you're very soon, out there trying to win business in Germany or Japan or the United States. So that's something very, very indigenous to small countries. And And I think as a small country, you're fundamentally you feel more vulnerable and maybe a little bit more paranoid because of that. And probably another factor is that, Swiss, other small countries, Denmark, Singapore, etc., they're more modest people, because if you think about it, I grew up in America, and there wasn't a history lesson that didn't mention some fantastic reason why America is such a great country. And if Donald Trump is now he's campaigning on that slogan, "Make America Great Again." And if you look at the UK, it's the Grand Empire, and in France it's the Grand Nation, and Germany had its Bismarck, China, etc. These big countries tend to breed a certain sense of pride, and there's a fine line between pride and arrogance. And very often these small countries can be, particularly if you're competing far away from home, you can kind of be the underdog and be more modest about doing business. And I think that's a subtlety, but I think it does help. Yeah, and I think another factor is being small is, as you probably know, living here, that there's probably a greater emphasis on the community here versus the individual. There's behavior is more regulated by social norms than regulations. People have a tendency more to collaborate than to compete. And so because of that, you have a greater sense of trust and probably lower friction costs and less cheating. And that's just fundamentally a much better environment to do business in.
Yeah. I mean, I'm struck by one of the statistics in your writing, which says that the average age of an S&P company is 15 years, S&P 500 company, versus in the SMI, the Swiss stock market, it's 125 years. So it's a huge difference in terms of longevity, in terms of staying power in the marketplace.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, it may be breaking down now. I mean, we've seen within the last 18 months, as you know, I mean, Syngenta and Holcim and Lafarge and Kuoni and Sika. So, a lot of it, there does seem to be tension on, and I actually wrote an article that was published in the Neue Zürcher about the changing attitude of ownership. But you had about around World War II in Anglo-Saxon societies, kind of the advent of this, this sort of agency risk, the idea that these companies are increasingly owned by disinterested shareholders as opposed to owner-operators, the old industrial families like the Rockefellers or the Carnegies, these sorts of things. And that began to break down when you had you sort of had the advent of these collective investment vehicles, mutual funds and ETFs and what have you. And I think a lot of that has to do with these new ownership structures, which have led to this new emerging class of managers who are effectively fiduciaries charged with running these companies, but often have very transient anonymous shareholders who maybe don't look at the shop as closely as they did in the former days. And I think Switzerland still has still retains a lot of the old ownership features that we had in other Anglo-Saxon countries, before World War II. And that has led to, as you point out, a greater longevity and probably just a greater engagement. In a lot of these Swiss companies probably would have gone bankrupt had they been in Anglo-Saxon countries today. So Nestle almost went bankrupt in 1923. ABB was bankrupt for a day in 2001. UBS was rescued by the Swiss government. The Swiss watch industry was bankrupt and had to be restructured. Roche was almost bankrupt twice. Yep. So probably, again, this attitude of community, long-term engagement, more interested owners. I think that's probably made the difference in these companies.
So as you were researching some of these stories, I mean, the industrial examples in the book, I mean, were any that really stood out and really resonated with you in terms of a huge surprise? You thought it was one way, but in actual fact, once you dug into it, it was very different, or that just struck you as being really a real characteristic of being Swiss? Any stories you can share on that journey?
Well, I mean, there's lots of them. I mean, by the way, I had a fellowship at Harvard in connection with the book. So we had access to all as part of this fellowship, I had access to all the case studies that were ever written about Swiss companies. And I think I was the first one to really have that. which was terrific. And we had Hans-Jörg Wyss as a supporter and George Pallo-Lehmann. These are Egon Zender. These are quite famous Swiss people who studied at Harvard. And
one of them's the 3G guy, right? Isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's an example of the Swiss diaspora, which is we can talk about as well, because that's one of the other sort of hidden secrets of Switzerland, is that, like the Jews or like the Chinese or the Scots, they do have a very, I think it's about 11% of Swiss live outside the country, which is the highest percentage of migrants in the world. So everyone talks about immigration, but people don't talk too much about migration. And I think that's one of Switzerland's unique features, is that they have such a high percentage of their own citizens that live and spend a good period of their life in other countries. And it seems to be inbred in sort of the DNA of formation that, they recommend to young people to, go to the army and then go spend 5 years abroad. So I think, and because of that, some people decide to stay, and you have these sort of diasporas like, George Pallo-Lehmann, who live and become very successful, in his case, Brazil. Yep. And you have that sort of feature. It's not unique to Switzerland, as I mentioned. There are other countries that have that as well. But
the other uniqueness is the number of people. I think 25% of the Swiss population is foreign as well, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's, of course, a very controversial issue. It's very difficult being a foreigner anywhere these days. But historically, Switzerland has had a huge advantage being on the crossroads, north to south, along the Gotthard, the flow of traffic going from Northern Europe to Italy, and then east to west for religious reasons was along the pathway of the route to Compostanello, which was a requirement for Catholics to undertake once during their lifetime. And people just ended up coming and liking it and staying. And so there's a very long tradition of immigration in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. As you know, there's multiple languages. And whenever there was political upheaval, take the Huguenots, for example, after the Edict of France was repealed and Huguenots were persecuted in France, they were very prevalent in the port cities of France, and they dispersed and came to Basel and to Geneva. And most of them came from the shipbuilding and sort of watchmaking industry, because at that time, the real key of telling time, the real value of telling time was having reliable clocks on board ships so that people could measure longitude. And people could always the techniques for measuring latitude were pretty well understood because of the sextant and because of the relationship to stars and equator, etc. But they couldn't figure out a way to really measure longitude, and the only way you could do that would be to install a clock that worked reliably, and you set the time to Greenwich, Connecticut. You have 360 degrees and around the globe, and each degree represents 12 minutes, and you could measure how far you were from Greenwich. But, imagine having a ship with, the moisture and the goings ups and down and rowing and water, etc. It was very difficult to have a mechanical instrument which kept precise time. Mm-hmm. And the Huguenots were really, that's what they were really good at. So that's, this is why this sort of very rural place out in the middle of nowhere in Geneva and then Le Loc and that region of the Jura developed an expertise in watchmaking because of that political turmoil. They were able to attract these Huguenots. And the same can be said about the chemical industry in Basel, which was a recipient of a lot of Jewish scientists from Germany, Poland, who were forced to leave their homes and come to Switzerland. And Roche, for example, was the only company that was amenable to hiring Jews.
Yeah. And they moved to New Jersey, I think, during that time, didn't they? Yeah.
They set up a research facility in Nutley specifically to house Jews. And they created a legal structure where a good bit of Roche's organization was owned by a U.S. entity legally in the event that the Nazis took over Switzerland.
So, I mean, if we go back to, I mean, you mentioned watchmaking. I mean, I think maybe we can just zero in on the Swatch story, because it is remarkable that the industry nearly collapsed, and then as a result of an enormous pivot, to use a kind of the West Coast language, where the watch was seen as a fashion item, that sort of created an enormously successful industry, which also isn't just at the low end, but also at the high end. It's created that. So, can you just tell the story of as you were researching? I mean, what stood out on that sort of tale, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Swatch story illustrates a number of interesting aspects of Swiss society and leadership and change and what have you. I mean, I'll just pick out a couple of them, but I mean, one is that success has many heroes, and Nicholas Hayek did a phenomenal job of profiling himself as being the inventor of Swatch, but in actual fact, he wasn't. And
it was Elmar Mock was one of them, I think, wasn't he?
Spot on. And really, I think Ernst Thomke, who kind of empowered Mock and pulled out sort of from the dustbin a very old patent that was really this idea of actually superimposing the watch structure within a plastic casing, which, by the way, still to this day has not been replicated in Asia. You would have thought that some sort of, you see Asians copying Swiss watches of any kind, but no one's been able to replicate the Swatch, because this plastic injection molding technology is very difficult to execute and very expensive. But that enabled them to produce a watch, for less than $20, which of course was, you can imagine the mindset of going from, producing watches that took, maybe a week to put together and cost $20,000 and required craftsmanship and expertise, and then having to go all the way to the other end of the continuum and come up with a watch which was wholly mechanized based on an entire different technology. And, the Swiss watch industry was pretty much designed around the Swiss military. So you had basically, generals or colonels running either factories producing watch parts or running the markets. And it was very much geared around the Swiss military. And, with military, you have bureaucracy and probably a difficulty adapting to new conditions. And of course, when the Japanese came out with this battery-operated watch, which just could tell time in a far superior manner, the customers just went in droves. And it was when Ernst Thomke and the head of Omega, they just done the pilot project, and they did two pilot projects for Swatch, one in San Antonio and the other one in Osaka. And they had these sort of military-looking watches. One of them was gray, slate gray, and the other one was black, and it all was very precise and accurate. And the pilot projects failed. The feedback from the markets was that you can't sell this watch. And of course, the company was basically bankrupt. They couldn't get any more credit from the banks. The best people were leaving, and Thomke was, suffering in great despair. And he stopped by Bloomingdale's in New York on the way back, and he met with the chief buyer, who's a Brooklyn sort of Jewish, hard-nosed buyer, New Yorker, and he was wearing a tie, this buyer, and he looked up to Thomke and this fellow who was running Omega and says, "You guys just don't get it. It's not about whether it tells time right or not. It's about fashion." And he lifted up his tie and showed him that. And so Thomke went, and this fellow came back to Switzerland, and he knew that there's a company called Fogal, which is, I don't know if you know it, but it's it's a women's lingerie business, and it was a family-operated business that was run by the Meyer family, and it used to produce uniforms, sort of boring nurse uniforms and old ladies' underwear. And they were on the verge of bankruptcy because of Asian competition, and they had actually turned it into a company producing lingerie and pantyhose, Strumpfhosen, because with these pantyhose you could produce them for about $1 or $2 and sell them for $50 or $100. So it was very profitable, these things. And the fellow that this family hired, who's the designer of this lingerie, came from Le Locle. His father worked at the watch industry, and so when Thomke said, he went and talked to his family. He said, well, how did you actually do this? How did you convert from this old uniform, old ladies' underwear company to a sleek, sexy lingerie company? He said, well, you have to meet our designer. So they introduced him to his designer, and that designer knew nothing about watches, but he was the one that actually ended up doing the first 325 models of Swatch. And it's been a while back, but at that time, people would sleep overnight waiting for his new designs to come out on Fifth Avenue. So that was.
So Apple wasn't the only one to create those raving fans. Yeah.
So that was an interesting story. I think that you mentioned Espresso. I think what kind of surprised me about Nespresso was that how much Nestle's senior management was against the innovation. So everyone at the senior level in Veve was against the Nespresso because they felt it would cannibalize their instant coffee, Nescafe, which was their most profitable product. So they basically put it on ice. It took 20 years for them to, the patent effectively wore out Nespresso before the fellow actually convinced them that there actually was an incremental market that would be available and now, meanwhile, Nespresso is by heads and shoulders the most profitable product of Nestle's 8,000 products. But people were completely dead against it. Helmut Malker, the chairman, refused to install a Nespresso machine until after he retired.
Extraordinary. Yeah.
So it just goes to show you that you often have resistance, not just the market, but just your own people.
So I mean, this is very interesting because a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs in large organizations wrestling with how to get their ideas adopted by those around them and by senior leadership. As you met some of these entrepreneurs who actually, reshaped, elements of Swiss industry, was there anything that sort of stands out about them that any behaviors, any characteristics that might help people who are struggling with this in large, sitting in a Novartis or a Syngenta or in a Roche today, for instance?
Yeah, well, I mean, anecdotally, because I think I interviewed about 300 people, and as you say, we did the research around the key innovations. The book is basically a chronicle of all these innovations. So, I think the sort of things you find is that first of all, I think people underestimate just how costly innovation is. It takes a lot of attempts, so you really do need a high tolerance for failure, and you have to have a disposition to take risks. And of course, we see the successes and we write about successes, but the fact is we don't talk about all the failed attempts that they don't make the history books. So one has to be pretty honest about that going into it. We talked about the immigrants. If you look, and this is not just Swiss, but just about every innovation in Switzerland had at least one key immigrant involved. Mm-hmm. Henry Nestle was an immigrant when he came to Veve. Hayek was Lebanese, on and on and on, but it's not any different anywhere else. If you look at Silicon Valley, Jeff Bezos' father's Cuban, the founder of eBay was Algerian, Sergey Brin's Russian. So so this seems to be characteristic of innovation in all sorts of places. I think that they were. I remember Charles Weissman, who was a co-founder of Biogen, and is muted to be a contender for a Nobel Prize on two fronts. He said, I was successful because I was unrealistic. And this is a famous molecular biologist and, the co-founder of the second biggest, most successful biotech company. He's Swiss. He's ran the molecular biology department at the University of Zurich. And he said I was successful because I was unrealistic, and basically what he was saying is that, if I would have been realistic, I would have never engaged in the areas of research that I did, because it was just such a slog, and the likelihood of succeeding was so low. So, there is that element of being a bit crazy, if you like. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the other thing is that, they aren't the nicest people, probably because they tune out. Imagine if you go to the tennis club and you go to all your buddies and you come up with this Nespresso idea, and then people are going to poo-poo it and tell you you're crazy, and you're probably going to succumb to that. So you have to probably be a bit autistic. So if you look at I read Steve Jobs' biography and Jeff Bezos, and most of these people are not the kind of people you want to have a beer with. So anyway, that's in that way. Nicholas Hayek was a pretty disagreeable fellow, and I can go on and on, but I'd prefer not to name names. But it's not unusual to be fairly difficult, because in a way you have to be kind of crazy, and B, you have to be really willing to fight the status quo. And there's a lot of embedded. I mean, I mentioned the example of Nespresso, but anytime you're coming up with something new, there's a status quo of resistance. There's employees that are afraid of losing their jobs. There's professors that are afraid of being discredited. There's investors that are afraid of losing their investment. There's governments that are afraid of losing their taxes. So, there's just a whole bunch of people out there that just don't want things to change because they feel threatened. So, one has to be very, pretty tough to work through all that.
Yeah, I mean that's the extraordinary dichotomy in this is the. As we said earlier on, the 125-year life expectancy of a company on the SMI versus some of these, near-death experiences that these companies have faced, and they've come back with leading positions in their markets and their product range as a result of taking some big bets. So there's a lot of forces at play here. I mean, the other thing that struck me, I think in Zurich, I mean, the Zuglers, the Google facility, I don't know how many people are employed there, but it's the largest facility of
1,300.
1,300 engineers. So it's the largest engineering group outside Silicon Valley, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, and actually, Urs Holzsee is a Swiss. He's, I think, the third employee of Google, and he's chief operating officer.
And why do they choose Switzerland? Because I mean, this is another element to the story, right?
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book called "Why Multinationals Love Switzerland," and I think that's particularly with the whole Brexit debate, the whole issue of the world's becoming much more like a aircraft carrier where people sort of pull into a port, and that port is Basel, or that port is Zug, or that port is London, and they want their planes to be refueled. They want their children to go to good schools. They want a decent tax regime and infrastructure, and they want to feel safe. And that whole package is a very important package in determining where capital will flow into which countries, where people will be designated to work. Google went through that assessment and that analysis, and they chose Zurich to a large extent because of the ETH, which is a fantastic and underrated university. It's sort of the MIT or the Cambridge of Switzerland on the technical side. There's more per capita, Nobel Prize winners from that university than anywhere else in the world. And so that was a key ingredient to be able to sort of tap into that intellectual garden, if you like. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, the spouses like Switzerland, so it's a really great place for spouses, men or women, who have to think about having a second career, or have to think about where their kids are going to get a decent education, or where they're going to spend their weekends, or how close it is to Italy or France, so how good are the airports? And these are all factors compared to Dubai or compared to Luxembourg or even London, which compete pretty well. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is a very important comparative advantage that historically Switzerland has had. It's like a lot of these things, it's showing some cracks, and one has to be careful that they can preserve this. But historically, they've had pretty good marks on that front.
Yeah. And, clearly, the other piece here is the ecosystem. I mean, here in Basel, arguably the center of the global pharmaceutical industry, there are lots of companies around the big players like Roche and Novartis that are attracted here. A company I'm chair of, we relocated from Finland to Switzerland just to be around these companies. So, and I guess this is something.
And also the startup scene, by the way, which is becoming increasingly important. I mean, there's not a company in Schlieren, which is, as you know, probably the sort of biotech hub of startups, which doesn't have an employee or a partner that's coming in some way related to the Basel pharmaceutical industry. And that's been a fantastic success story for Switzerland. And by the way, I mean, just for the record, in 1980, at that time, 3 major pharmaceutical companies, but today Novartis and Roche were really kind of laggards. They were not particularly strong in the total scheme of things. I mean, this was the days of Wellcome and Pfizer's and Bristol's Myers and SmithKline Beecham's and of course the Germans and the French and the Swiss were kind of bottom of the barrel. And roll the clock forward, these two companies have done much better, and they're now leading the pack. And I think that in and of itself is sort of embodies sort of a lot of the analysis and points that we're talking about today.
Yeah. Now, one final question. I mean, you've got another book you're working on at the moment. Called, I think, the working title is Too Small to Fail. And I'm interested, I mean, you touched on Finland earlier on. Do you see a connection between small companies' success and the national service? I'm thinking Finland, Switzerland, and Israel in particular. Is this something, clearly a lot of executives in large Swiss corporations are also senior folks in the Swiss army. I just wonder, is this something that you think is part of the story?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, we talked earlier about this sort of where countries are in the continuum between community and individual, kind of consideration, selfishness. And yeah, I do think these small countries have a much stronger social glue. And probably the Brexit result was to some extent a reversion to the mean where, there's a trade-off between national sovereignty and globalization. So I think these aspects will take on greater import as we progress going forward, and yes, I think these small countries have, in that respect, and in very different ways, seem to appeal to the community aspects, which I think are very important. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing, which is where the wind is at the back of these smaller countries, is that. The fact is that global trade is growing at a much faster clip than GDP growth. So, which is basically saying it is this globalization that because of the low cost of transport, the fact that an idea can come from anywhere, a technology can come from anywhere, the means of production can come from anywhere, the financing can come from anywhere, and the customers can come from anywhere. So, we're just living in a much more open world, and these small countries get that, and they have disproportionately participated in the fact that global trade has grown at a much faster clip than GDP production. And I think they're going to continue to be able to take more than the lion's share of these benefits, which will create some political tensions, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, I used to travel quite a lot to China and Sao Paulo from Zurich, and it was always a leading indicator on a Sunday evening is how busy was a business class Swiss Air flight out to those locations, because you might be reading in the paper that things were slowing down, but you wouldn't have thought so, fighting for a seat with executives trying to go out and do business from Switzerland. So, and on that subject, I mean, just a quick segue into another thing that you do, James, is you run a fund which was originally founded with the support of Sir John Templeton. And
That's right.
And I'm a great follower of his philosophy. I'm just curious, as you've looked at these companies and innovation in, as you say, industrial business to business context versus a sort of breathless Elon Musk-like, high tech Silicon Valley innovation. How do you look at, as you assess either an existing holding in your fund or you're thinking about putting some money to work, how do you think about innovation, disruption, new entrants, changing consumer patterns? I mean, it's a big question, but I mean, do you adapt your investment approach as a result of having looked at these Swiss companies?
Absolutely. I think, again, I think it's very tempting if you can, everyone would have been in Amazon. It's up 3,600% over the last 10 years. And, I wasn't in it. It was always too expensive for me. And I suppose there's a lot of people out there that felt quite the same. And that's maybe one of the disadvantages of the Templeton school, that you're really looking for deep discounted value. And I know we met through Guy Spear, and he very much feels the same way. The fact is that there were like 3 or 4 technology companies that really won that game.
Yep.
So if you were in Genentech, if you were in, Google, if you were in Amazon, you've done extremely well. Facebook, you've done extremely well. But, that's it. It's really been sort of a winner take all. And these companies are becoming sort of the Exxons and the AT&Ts of our generation. They're very much, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discussion about monopolies. I think the safer bets are going with companies that, Schindler's gone up 15 times in the last 10 years.
The elevator company.
Yeah, the elevator company. And Ems Chemie, which manufactures specialty plastics. The story of Roche.
Yep.
So, there's maybe you're not going to get 3,600%, but, 1,500% is not bad at all. And these are companies which are a little less flashy, but, and probably a little bit have, as Warren Buffett says, sort of larger moats where it's a bit difficult I think they have franchises which are more resilient to intrusion.
But James, two things. We had Larry Cunningham on the show a few months ago, and we talked about that at length. But in your book, you do talk about two industries at risk, right? One is wealth management, which I think everyone can understand, but you also talk about pharma. Do you see the moat there getting shallower and narrower?
Yeah, I think the pharma industry will be a disappointing industry for the next generation for a number of reasons. One, I think there's just diminishing returns with regard to technology, and increasing costs with regard to discovery. And, the fact is we're all living to be, 80 years old, and there's some mathematical limit to how long we can live, and the sort of reasons for our lives not being cut off at some point, or by and large have been eliminated, and except for cancer and the type of ailments and diseases are more age-induced diseases, whether it's arthritis or Alzheimer's, and that becomes a very difficult political discussion and debate, given the fact that the number of people working versus the number of people retired, and the ability to fund healthcare systems. To what extent are people willing to really channel money into research for that sort of thing? And then the famous moral dilemma. What is the value of life? How much can you charge for someone to live 6 months if you only have a 20% chance of taking a cancer drug, which will work? So I think there's a lot of vectors which will make it very difficult. It's going to be an uphill battle. And I think it's just a matter of time before the U.S. reduces pricing, and they are really the gravy train for pharmaceutical companies is the U.S. pharmaceutical market, because it has twice the level prices as Japan and Europe, and it's just a matter of time before that arbitration is gone. So yeah, I think it'll be very difficult. But there's a lot of other industries which are coming about and will be very attractive. And a lot about choosing investments and choosing careers is catching the right wave, and that's what it's about. And when I was, and it's very much a proactive thing, because when I was growing up, everybody wanted to work for IBM, and then they wanted to work for McKinsey's and Goldman Sachs, and these opportunities, of course, have changed over time.
Yep. So excellent. So I sent through to you, James, 3 questions a few days ago. I'd just like to segue to those. So the first one is around your morning rituals.
It's not very. I normally get up around 5 o'clock, sometimes 6. I'm not terribly precise about it. I wake up when my body wakes up, and I have my laptop in the bed, and I go through the headlines. I'm on Twitter, and I have my Twitter feeds, and I'm following people who I admire, whose information I trust. And then I have a stack of reading next to my bed, and I'm reading the FT and the Economist, and then just specific things that come to my attention. So unfortunately, it's not a particularly exciting morning. And then I am generally reserving my mornings for analytical work and writing, and then afternoons for phone calls and meetings. That's pretty much how I'm trying to, and I'm probably confining travel, because I just find it just increasingly awkward and costly to travel. So I'm batching it more than I used to.
Got it. Okay. Second question. What have you changed your mind about recently?
Well, this morning or just...
Something a little bit more profound, perhaps. What pair of socks to wear this morning?
Yeah. No. Well, probably on the superficial front, I change my mind just about every week on financial markets. But I don't seem to be alone on that front. But no, I think, where have I been wrong? I think the whole energy opportunity set has changed radically. I think most of us felt that, oil and coal and these sorts of commodities would be here to stay. And it's just quite remarkable to see what sort of inroads that solar and shale have made and how that's changed the geopolitical situation in the world. I think that, maybe, Brexit sort of caused me to revise my understanding of British identity. And, I was sort of expecting a poised, confident, stiff upper lip. And, it feels a bit like ranting children bickering with each other. So it's... Yeah. Anyway, but I guess those are the examples of things that I've revised my views. I'm revising my views probably more often than most people, I suppose.
Well, nothing wrong with that. It's like if the information's changing, one needs to, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Third and final question. And you touched on it a little bit around when you were growing up, IBM, McKinsey. What advice would you have for your 25-year-old self?
Well, I'll repeat. I think catching a wave is very important, and that, of course, is a really tough one to get. But because 80% of the jobs that are going to be there in 15 or 20 years are not there now. So I think it's really important. When I look at the people that have been truly successful, a lot of them have been very fortunate in terms of choosing, they weren't particularly brilliant, but they chose the right way. So I'd say that's very important.
But so the plastic, what's the 2016 version of the graduate advice plastics? What would you say is the wave to look at the moment, based on your perspective?
I think this internet has legs. I really think, that how the internet will change the way products are sold and produced and serviced. We're just in the early innings of that. So I would have thought if you could get some experience with the kind of eBays and social media advertising and Zolandas of this world, I would have thought that's probably not a bad bet, I'd say.
We had Kevin Kelly on the show a few weeks ago. And it was extraordinary. I don't know whether you've read his latest book. It's gone straight to the top of the New York Times, but called The Inevitable. But he talks a lot about AI and so that's his thesis, certainly.
Yeah. I think I guess my view is a bit more that would be sort of if you like the offensive way of approaching a career. Maybe cautiously. Probably the truth is that because of the uncertainty, that all these jobs are going to be out there and you don't know what they are. I think other people, maybe young people, and I didn't know this when I was younger, that 80% of your relationships are made by the time you're 30 years old. So I think it's really important I'm really happy I worked with Rothschilds and Templeton and Harvards and these sorts of things, because it really introduced me to a whole bunch of people that provided valuable and lasting relationships. So I guess my advice would be pretty picky about who you're meeting during those ages between 20 and 30, because those are going to be your buddies. And as you get older, you just don't meet very many new people. Yeah. So that would be maybe one. I jotted down some notes when you asked me to. I was, prompted for this question. I think science versus arts, skills versus knowledge, which is against, a lot of this sort of liberal arts type of stuff that we grew up with, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world. Yeah, if you can go to one of the great schools and have a liberal arts education, fantastic. And I still think it's a really valuable thing to have. But if you don't get into one of these great schools, having a mediocre liberal arts education, I don't think is going to take you very far, in my view. And then there's just the classic, just find something you're really passionate about, where you really have a talent, you feel you're better, and intersect that with a market need, and be pretty, fail fast. If you don't have all three of those things lined up, those ducks lined up, then move on and try something else, because it's a pretty competitive world out there, and maybe that's probably new for our children compared to us. We have an intern working. He's an IIT graduate, just graduated last month from Delhi, and he's working for 1/12 the price of an ETH graduate, and these guys are hungry.
Yep.
And that's that they want our lunch, and that's
scary.
And then I'd say, just as opposed to picking company names, find people. It's really the people you work for, not the. There's no Mr. McKinsey, there's no Mr. Goldman Sachs, there's no. You really want to choose people, and if you look at people who worked at PayPal or people in the hedge fund industry that worked for Caxton's or Genentech in the molecular biology industry, it was those people who chose to work for those organizations who at the time were not known. They were just good at recruiting very good people.
No, good advice, very good advice. So James, final question. You mentioned you're on Twitter. Where can people get in touch with you? How can they follow you or connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I think it's Breiding3, if I'm not mistaken.
We'll put it in the show notes. Okay.
Yeah, and then I think we have it's called Swiss Made Foundation. I have to check it quickly. Just 1 second. We have a website, but I have to.
Well, we otherwise you can send me the details. We'll put it all in the show. But people can connect with you through the book, through Twitter.
There you go.
Okay.
That's right. And the book's on Amazon, so have a look at it. And there's a few videos if you just want to take a shortcut.
Wonderful. And your new book is work in progress, but coming out in 2017?
Yeah, we have a team, and we're working at it now. And it's basically called Too Small to Fail. And it talks about how small countries like Switzerland, Denmark, Singapore, Israel, Ireland, why they've managed to get some things right. And, if you look at the 15 highest disposable incomes in the world, 12 of them are countries with populations of less than 20 million people. If you look at Gini coefficients, if you look at happiness, desirabilities, it all sort of points in the same direction. And I'm just intrigued by that and trying to. We're doing a bunch of research to understand why that is, and hopefully share something which people find interesting, informative, valuable.
Wonderful. Well, once it's out, you've got a publication date, maybe we can get you back on the show to tell that story. It is a slightly counterintuitive story, but it's also, as you say, the data is quite compelling. But in the meantime, really like to thank you for your time, James. This has been fascinating, particularly for our Swiss, but also many of our non-Swiss listeners. There's plenty to listen to and to learn from. Thanks for your time, and have a good summer.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Thank you.
Hi, this is Mark again. As I said at the introduction to this show, James's book is essentially a chronicle of Swiss innovation. And a few things really stood out for me. First, how much resistance these entrepreneurs and these innovators actually faced as they were driving these innovations into their organizations. Secondly, the power of the ecosystem and the way that new businesses are constantly being formed and developed and spun out of the incumbent players, be it individuals, be it technologies, be it business models. And this is something we see a lot of in the pharmaceutical ecosystem here in Switzerland. Thirdly, the importance of developing the export business. Essentially, this means that any Swiss business is essentially an international business. And when you combine this with the low-key way that many Swiss do business abroad, given that so many Swiss, I think 11% of them, tend to live abroad, this has clearly contributed to the country punching way above its weight in terms of financial, global, commercial activity, and its reach extending into all corners of the globe. And finally, the link between military national service and strong business, that this exists in several small but very successful countries like Finland, like Israel, and like Switzerland. And I'm sure that James, in his upcoming book, Too Small to Fail, will go into this in more detail. So I urge you to get a copy of this book. It really was a fascinating read for me, and James has done a great job, and I'm sure he'll continue to do a great job in his next book, and we'll have him back on the show to tell us the story of how that's going once he's got it published. For those of you who want to know more, please go over to our website. You can download the transcript of this episode. You can see in the show notes some of the references that James referred to in the conversation, as well as get a visual image of the interview and a number of other resources. Thank you for your time. Look forward to hearing your comments on this show, as well as any of the previous shows that you might not have had a chance to listen to yet. And until then, have a great week.